Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of discussions for ACS 557, International Public Relations, and I would add, and not only, because it's not only about international public relations. We have our requirements for the class, but also we will go by the qualifications, research propensities of the people that we are discussing with. So I set up the tone, we exchanged some emails. Today, gracefully accepted was another discussion, but with Dr. Cesar Garcia. Dr. Cesar Garcia is a full professor at Central University. He received his PhD from the Complutense University of Madrid, Spain. Dr. Garcia specializes in teaching and research on public relations and communication. He has more than a decade of experience in the professional world of public relations for international firms such as Edelman and Pleon, where he implemented communication programs for global companies. Dr. Garcia has published in academic publications such as Public Relations Review, Public Relations Journal, Journal of Communication Management, and International Journal of Strategic Communication. I know personally Dr. Garcia because we were, I think, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we were hired into the higher education system in the United States, coming from two different countries, and we were exchanging ideas when we were going to NCA or ICA, and it was a very fertile ground, but our, pathways separated. We went our separate ways. So, we said that we can start with some questions. Dr. Garcia, do you have your own, I don't know, PowerPoint presentation or something? Some people started with that, but I don't want to take that from you if you have it. If not, I would go directly to the questions.
No, I didn't have any. I don't have any presentation. I think it's better to start with questions, and hopefully we can start conversation as well.
No, this is the format that I asked the students to participate in, but I had other people in different discussions who were trying to kind of come with their own style of exchanging ideas. So let's go directly to the questions then, and I will start with my own questions. To your view, what are some key characteristics of public relations in international settings? Examples of specificities in public relations in Latin America, if you can give them, because I know that you have done research in that area, Western, Eastern European settings, Asia, that you have noted in your research.
Well, the first thing my approach to international public relations is, especially when I talk to American students, is that we should consider that the United States is the exception to the norm. I think, in a way, the rest of the world look more alike than the United States. United States is specific, is insular, and it's its own world in a way. United States represent about 5% of the world population. It represents about 16, 17% of the wealth in the entire world. So it's a very minuscule part of the world, and even the Western world is relatively small. We consider the Western world, we're talking about 600 million, 700 million people, still small. Considering that the global population is about 7.5 million these days. So what we're going to find in the rest of the world is the norm, and what we find in the United States is the exception. That's something that I always like to clarify. Differences. This is one of question I tend to ask like an essay question to my students at the end of the class. That is like, okay, can you write 3 pages explaining what's the difference between the United States and the rest of the world, So they need to summarize everything that they learn in the course. I would say that a key difference is that for me is that in the United States, people tend to feel more comfortable, and I'm just going straight to the field of public relations. But in general, something I've observed is that people in the United States feel more comfortable interacting with organizations. I find that you just have to go, for example, to Amazon.com. When you buy a product, you go and you look for reviews to see what people say, and you find a number of reviews about any product, even razors you want to for shaving, or napkins, or anything. You find a number of reviews. When you go to Amazon in different countries, you find very few. You find very few reviews, and that's already telling me something, and it's already telling me that people feel more committed in general in United States to interact with organizations. They feel more comfortable. Organizations are more part of the American life, in American life, than in most of the world, even in Europe. I think organizations here, because the state, the American state, and I think that's something we are seeing somewhat in this COVID crisis, always has played a relatively minor role in American life in many aspects. People are more accustomed to see organizations taking the role of the state, and doing things through foundation, but also just through donations, through organization of events that in most of the world it hasn't happened, or it's something relatively new. So I would say that that's a key difference I've observed. I've also noticed that it's important when we're talking about the size of the organizations. This is something I deal with in my articles. Is that when you have a economy with organizations that have a larger size, these organizations can have a more longer term perspective. When you have organizations with small budgets, their approach tends to be more marketing based, short term, more focused on marketing and advertising, trying to materialize the sales as soon as possible. While in the US, there are a bunch of companies that can't really afford to have this long-term perspective, this idealistic idea, because the US is not perfect either, of building long-term relationships, and that only can be done. It can be done more. Can be done better when you have a longer budget. When you have a larger size. When you are a small organization, it's much more difficult. And in most of the world, I would say that most of the countries, about 95, even a higher percentage of the organizations are very small. So in a number of countries, you only find that public relations, as we understand here, are practiced by international companies. They are practiced by the subsidiaries that they have there. But most of the organizations, they do take a marketing approach. Another big difference, and this is a commonality between Asian and Latin American countries, is the importance of personal relationships. In the US, personal relationships are important. I mean, we have the concept of networking here. The word networking is an important word here. But it doesn't, to do networking, it doesn't mean to cultivate personal relationship as it means outside of the United States. I'm including even Europe, or most of Europe, where it's not that, for example, if we talk about Latin America, in Latin America, if you want, for many people, if you want to do business, if you want to have a relationship with them, some kind of business relationship, as the business relationship that, for example, a journalist can have with a public relations practitioner, you need to cultivate the personal aspect. It's the same thing in China. They have the expression "wan qi." Wan qi means good relationships in Chinese, and basically you develop a relationship with a Chinese official or with a Chinese journalist in a number of ways, but one of them is an exchange of gifts, getting together to have lunch or to have dinner, uh, seeing each other maybe during the weekend, seeing each other often, and often is not once every say 6 months or once every year. Often is maybe once every 2 weeks, or every week or every month. You make in Spain, for example, you make gifts for Christmas. During Christmas season, you have a list of journalists and you send them a leg of ham. A leg of ham is very appreciated, and if that's a key journalist for you, you're gonna spend a good amount of money in a leg of ham, to show your friendship, your appreciation for that journalist. So I would say that that's a very, very important factor. And when you review, and this is something I do in my classes, is to review a number of case studies of countries, and try to look for points of comparison with the US. And you realize that the personal factor is still very important. So we have these textbooks that talk about the reality that is kind of clean, like rational, where the best arguments win, where the best actions are appreciated and win as well. And the truth is that there are many other factors that really play a role that don't have much to do with it. Another factor that is important, and this is, I would say, is, for example, these days, is the level of internet penetration. In the US, the internet penetration is about 90%. I would say that in most of Europe, Japan, Australia, it's about between 80 and 90. Well, in Latin America, the average is about 40, 50% of internet connection. Some countries have less, some countries have more, but when the internet penetration is low, it means that a number of people are going to have are going to be connecting to the internet in cafes. They're going to be connecting to the internet at work, and that creates a very different dynamic. In other countries, people spend even more time in social networks than here. Latin countries, for example, you find that people like to feel connected because of this importance of personal relationship. And in Argentina, people do spend way more time than in the US in Facebook, connecting with friends, So I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about economy. And I would say that theory, when we talk about theories, I think there was a question that had to do with differences between schools in Latin America, schools in the US. The truth is that people tend to learn more or less the same theory in all the schools, because a number of, most of the textbooks that we use are Anglo-based. They are from American authors, British publishers, and in very few countries they do have local authors. Most of the authors are edited by these American publishers. And what you find in these countries are translations. So when they study in many ways the same normative ideal that American students do. It's just that the reality is different, and their beliefs and values of that society are different. So what they study, there is a discrepancy between what they study in the books and what they do once they are working in the professional arena. I don't know if that's, I talk about a number of topics here, but I was trying to summarize a little bit what I've found after all this time.
Definitely, I heard some highlights in which, you mentioned that the knowledge about public relations and the definitions and the books and the theories emanate from the United States. The whole idea started in the United States. And, for people interested in the history of public relations, Bernays was talking about the fact that public relations was studied as a need to communicate better with people who had lower wages, who had to start consuming things at the mass level at the beginning of the 20th century. And then this kind of method of communicating with these masses has spread around the world. So I have another question for you. How are characteristics of public relations impacted by culture, societal trends, the economy, politics?
I think in a way, I mean, I've answered, maybe I've anticipated that question. I think in some country, in some parts of the world, economy is more important. In some parts of the world, I'm talking about the size of the companies. I think that's a very important factor. How I mean, I notice it even in the U.S. I mean, my students in Central Washington do very different public relations than my students in Seattle. My students in Seattle have access to T-Mobile, Microsoft, they work for Amazon, they work for Starbucks, etc., etc. And the type of public relations they do are very different than the public relations that the microbreweries do in where I live, or the wineries, or the Chamber of Commerce, the local Chamber of Commerce. Eh? The normative ideal for Microsoft or for Starbucks is a much more two-way ideal, you know, a much more relational approach. While the at the local level, when you work for a lawyer or you work for a chamber of commerce, is less relational and is more persuasive, you know. So you can do the same when you think, I mean, the same type of reasoning when you are thinking about the difference between the US or the most developed countries and countries that are developing countries, you know, where you find that their concern is sales, you know, and when your concern is sales, you don't have time to develop these long conversations um, with your stakeholders, you know. Say this. I mean, not every. I mean, in the U.S., we tend to think that the social media have helped a lot, and that the connection between organizations and stakeholders in America is so much better now than it used to be. But the truth is that when you go to most of the Twitter or Facebook pages or Instagram of these companies, the truth is that there's not much conversation either. I mean, what you tend to see and hear as well is that a number of these organizations, they just post, they communicate about product, you know, they communicate, it's also very marketing based, you know, and there's not much debate. Huh? There's not much action.
I think from time to time, I think from time to time they come back to social media when they need to fix a crisis.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and sometimes some company, I mean, Starbucks try harder, and Nike, and you know, some company. But even if you go to Nike to the homepage, I mean, these days that we are hearing about Nike and the Black Lives Matter movement and etc. But the truth is that most of the time, what Nike spends the time is talking about product, mainly. But saying that, I mean, I'm having a large budget and a large team of people. You can practice more public relations, or at least a little closer to what we read in the textbooks. You know. Another interesting aspect, and I haven't mentioned it, is also another difference is that the notion of multiculturality that we have here in the United States is not as present in other societies. Here in the US, we have different, we talk about ethnicity, and we have different ethnic groups competing in the public sphere and for resources, you know. African American, Latinos, Native American, Asian American, etc. This is the way American society is conceived. Different groups competing in the public sphere for attention, rights, jobs, whatever. When you are in American society, you are immediately put in one of these groups. You know, in other societies that are also pluralistic in ethnic terms, that's not the case. It's not the case in Latin America. in Latin America, you have different ethnic groups, but there is the idea that it's more like, I mean, the word mestizaje, mestizaje, mix is a word, it's a Spanish term, and it admits that people is not necessarily don't necessarily can be classified as white or black or Asian, but that they're mixed, you know. So this idea that is a very American idea of classifying into ethnic groups, you know, that compete between them, you know, to somewhat, that doesn't happen, for example, in Latin America. And Latin American societies are as diverse as American society. So in Latin America, it's not like here that often you have to sign, okay, what's your race, or, you know, what's your ethnic group. In many countries, nobody asks you that. So this idea makes that the conception of multicultural public relations that we have here, it's not the case in many parts of the world. Even in France, that's not the case. It's a society that is supposed to be colorblind. We know the reality is different, but this is the Republican ideal of the French Republic. Talks about, you know, the French school is going to make you the same type of individual. It doesn't matter what race is your race, you know. So I think that's an important, and we should be aware that every time that the world is not uniform anymore, and that something we need to learn is that in different societies we're going to find different ethnic groups.
But also, I would say that you know, as a critical scholar, I would draw a sign of alarm also in the American society, where you can argue, you know, if you are part of a certain minority, you don't have the equal access to resources and to means of communication. You do not, as a business person or you know, somebody who has a business initiative, if you don't qualify, the bank doesn't qualify you to start that business at the same rate with the majority of the population, then there will be differences. Then you cannot do the same kind of business, then you cannot express the same in the same way, then you cannot lead your life in an equal manner. So that's why sometimes access to resources trickles down into societal issues. That's what I see exploding now.
A lot is being said here these days about that, and I hope more is said, because I think that's an important aspect of what's going on in the U.S. these days. That inequality. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. But I mean, when I was referring to the Latin American example, I mean, most of the societies, what not many Americans know is that most of the societies are multi-ethnic. So when you, in Western Europe, I would say that between 10 and 15% of the people who live in any country, they were born outside of that country. I'm talking in the 2020, you know. And there are minorities everywhere. And there are minorities in Portugal, in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Italy, you know. So, I mean, there are minorities in Saudi Arabia, there are minorities in Iraq, you know. So when we look at the world map, we should be aware of that the idea of multiculturality or diversity is not only something that happens in America, you know. Australia is a very diverse country. Canada is a very diverse country. Mexico is diverse, you know. So I think that's something that sometimes we overlook, and it's important to recognize, you know, and that the approach that we have here is not the same approach that other governments, other societies take regarding diversity. And I don't know what was the right approach. I don't know, but it's different.
So what do you mean by that? It's different. Meaning, is it better here? Is it better somewhere else?
I think in the U.S. society is more visible. I think there is more effort to make it visible in the public sphere. In other countries, it's not as visible. It's visible in the street. It's visible, but it's not as visible. You know, it's not as visible on TV. It's not as visible. I don't think, for example, the Latin American soap operas reflect the ethnic diversity in Latin America. I don't think the advertising in Latin America reflects that, you know. Yeah? So for an American, that can be shocking sometimes. Even the way people talk in other societies, you know. I mean, here, in order to dignify other groups, we found terms like Asian America, African Americans, etc. In other societies, like in Latin America, the way people call a black person can sound brutal, but maybe for that black person, it's not necessarily, it's not pejorative at all. Yeah. So
Yes, but beyond the politeness and you know, speaking correctly to somebody, are the issues solved?
no, I don't think so. I don't think they're solved, but it's a different.
Yeah.
It's a different approach. That, for example, the brands in these societies, they don't necessarily need to take a specific approach for a specific ethnic groups. That's what I mean. You know, there's not a black approach in Brazil to target the African descent population in Brazil. Before Bolsonaro, I mean, it's not about Bolsonaro, it was before, you know. The same thing in countries where there are whites and blacks and brown, like Colombia or Peru. It's not, there's not an approach that is comparable to the American approach, you know.
I saw, by the way, I saw today an image somebody was sending from Brazil, showing people packed together, some of them having masks. They were in a subway, in a metro, you know, train, commuting, I guess, for jobs. And they were all black men and women, and they were like in a sardine box. And it was about, this is the modern version of a slave boat.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly a sense of inequality, but that is the plasticity of this inequality is different than in American society. You know, that's what I was talking about.
Right.
That
Right.
it's basically the same problem, but it's a different manifestation.
At least we speak nicely, and we stop the cameras from the police.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that things are worse here by any means, but not in every aspect they are worse in Latin America, for example.
Right.
Not in every aspect.
Yes.
I think in Latin America, the process of nationalization, and that's more something that it's more in agreement with the Republic, it's more present in Latin America, you know, like the idea that you are nationalized, and when you are nationalized, differences are irrelevant, you know.
Right. Okay, let's go down the list from the students. I'm sorry that Shui Tingbai, my master student from China, is not present today, but she will see this video later. But she asked, what is the difference between Chinese and Western perspectives in regards to the ideal of public relations? And you touched some on that. And what factors cause the differences between China and Western countries in regards to the ideal of public relations?
But I think, I mean, the most obvious factor is the political system. While in China, it's not. I mean, you know, you have this economic. I mean, you have a kind of a mixed system that in the course is sort of capitalist, you know, but in political terms is still a communist regime, you know, at least.
Oops, the connection. Hello. Is it my connection?
We can call it propaganda, is this idea that having an authoritarian government and having a collectivistic society was a positive factor. something that Westerners need to learn from. You know, for example, when you are in a situation like the pandemic, it's the lesson is that the Westerners should learn from it. You know, so I think the cultural factor of in collectivistic societies to have an authoritarian regime where you feel comfortable be or relatively comfortable being in the hands of the government is not uh, it's it's fine, you know. It can be good in situations like this, you know.
Right. And you know, what does it mean comfortable? Because, you know, I lived in a former
Is
socialist
the,
country. And hello, can you hear me? I think my connection is dropping. Hello? Hello?